Hi there, and welcome to Military Histories, a podcast from York Army Museum. Each week we share an interview from the Royal Dragoon Guards audio archive. This season we will be sharing interviews with veterans of the Korean War. You can find more details about the Royal Dragoon Guards Oral History Project in the show notes. If you want to find out a bit more about our museum, there are links to our website and social media channels in the show notes too. In this week's interview you can hear Mr Jack Bellinger describe his experiences from joining the army in 1947 until leaving the army just after the end of the Korean War. Thanks for listening. Future episodes will drop every Friday.
I am Lieutenant Colonel retired Barry Port, and today I'm interviewing Jack Bellinger at his house in Kennington near Oxford. Jack, to start the interview, can I first of all ask you for your date of birth and a very quick resume of your army service?
Yeah, okay. Right, I was born on the 7th of June, 1929, and I joined the army in May 1947. The reason I joined the army, I was not satisfied with Civvy Street. So I volunteered. I went to the recruiting office in St Ebbs in Oxford in February 47, and it took until May before I eventually joined the army. I had a letter to inform me to report to Slade Barracks at Cowley, which was a temporary barracks off the Oxford and Bucks Castle barracks. I joined there in late May and did 6 weeks course with the Oxford and Bucks Light Infantry. It consisted just basic training, which was foot drill, arms drill. We did a couple of days at Bisley rifle shooting. Other than that, that was it. One of the things that stands out in my memory was when I joined and we went to the stores, we were given 3 empty Palace bags and a pillow, and we were taken to a hut where we filled them with straw, and that's what we slept on for those 6 weeks. From Cowley Barracks, I moved up to Catterick, and I came under the training regiment of the 17th 21st Lancers. I did a course on driver operator, and the tanks we trained on was the American Chaffee, which was a semi-automatic gearbox, which wasn't a very exciting thing to learn anyway. And after 5 months in Catterick, we were posted to Barnard Castle transit camp. This was late winter 47, very, very cold, very austere barracks, wash and shave in cold water sort of thing. And after a week there, we did a passing out parade, and we were shipped to Germany, Bielefeld, which was another transit camp. We were in Bielefeld for about a week. Once again, just basic information and things like that. And we were told to parade at 4 o'clock one morning, and we were told where we were going to be posted. Well, when I volunteered for the army, I volunteered for the 17th 21st because I had a school friend in there. 10th Royal Hussars, I had a school friend in there, and the 47th Dragoons. I had a very far distant friend in there. I was called on parade at Bielefeld and told I was going to the 5th Royal Inniskilling Dragoon Guards. And when I said to the sergeant parading, why aren't I going to one of the regiments I volunteered for? His curt report was, you'll learn not to volunteer in the army, you're going to the skins. And so we got on a train at Bielefeld, and we pulled into Munster very early that morning. And what struck me about Munster was there was not one building standing inside. Every house was demolished. The only thing standing were the chimney breasts, which obviously could withstand the blast. We were picked up by a lorry from Munster Station, and I went to the skins at Munster. I was posted to A Squadron, and this was on the 23rd of December 47. As is normal, I was on guard duty for Christmas Day.
Wonderful.
That's the way to break you in, I suppose. But from there, we did quite a lot of training with A Squadron, normal basic training again, foot drill, arms drill, etc., etc. And other than that, it was rather a boring time.
So before we go any further with your time at the regiment, I'd like to just go back to your time in training and get a bit more of a feel for how the basic training went. So you actually volunteered to join the army, so you weren't part of conscription or national service?
No.
But your training at Catterick, or your initial training, were you all lumped together? Were there sort of national service people there? Or were you all people just volunteered?
From the squad from Cowley, I was the only regular soldier out of about 20 in the squad. But when I got up to Catterick, there was a little bit better mix, but the majority of the training group I was with were national servicemen.
So can I, obviously not being involved with national service, I mean, what was the feeling from those who had been basically called up to do their national service? Were they happy to be there, generally speaking?
There was a very mixed feeling amongst them. There was a couple of cockneys I remember. They turned up with the hair on their shoulders. They went to the barber and they shaved them right over the top, which didn't please them very much. But generally speaking, except for one or two, they accepted their fate. They said, because in those days it was 18 months national service. It did go up to 2 years during the Korean crisis, but initially it was 18 months. And yeah, I think most of the young guys said, this is their lot and we'll put up with it.
And did they come from the same area as you, or did they come literally
countrywide? No, they came from all over the country.
Right.
Well, when I say all over the country, mostly perhaps from Birmingham down south. I don't remember any Jocks or Yorkshiremen in amongst them, but I suppose everybody being strangers, you just accepted a couple of friends and you got on well with 2 or 3 guys.
Right.
So you sort of isolated yourself away from the whole group.
And did your group, were they already sorted out as, these guys are going to be armoured soldiers and going to Catterick, or did you sort of split up and go different ways?
No, from Cowley, several people went to different regiments. If I remember rightly, there was out of the group from Cowley, there was no more than about 5 who went up to Catterick with me.
Right.
And they were national servicemen, so their fate was wherever they were going to be posted after Catterick.
Thank you. Now, once you arrived at Catterick, what was the training like? What was the daily routine, and how were you treated?
First of all, we were told that the webbing equipment was no longer Blanco; it was boot polish. So we were issued with scrubbing brushes and soda water, and we scrubbed all our Blanco equipment, including the large pack, small pack, belt, bracers, you name it, holster, pistol holster, the lot. We scrubbed them, dried them out, and then we applied Kiwi black boot polish, which you had to put on one thin coat at a time, and then the next day another coat until you get a good shine, and then you polish them, and that was your equipment for the future as we knew it. The training was quite basic, I think, when I compare it with my later life of training. You went to a classroom, they didn't teach you a terrible lot about the functions of engines and driving and things like that. It was even though we were there for 5 months, bear in mind there were lots of fatigue weeks where you had to do fatigues, kitchen duties, camp cleaning, you name it, all those sort of things. We did some big vehicle driving on the roads in the old 1500 weights then. Then we went onto the tank park. As I say, we they taught us to drive on the American Chaffee tank, which was a poor old thing anyway. And obviously we went out on the moors driving cross country and also a bit of road driving. There was not a lot to do in the evenings. It was very, very basic, low morale, I would call it, because we were expecting lots of different things.
Right. What about how are you treated by the NCOs? You hear a lot about the harshness of during National Service days, but what was your experience?
My experience with Catterick was the NCOs were very, very hostile. They had no respect for young soldiers. They treated us very badly, and I always remember one night after I'd had quite a beating up from, not physical, but from a corporal. I vowed that if ever I became an NCO, I would never treat soldiers the same. And I can say definitely I did not. I always respected young soldiers, and I treated them as they should be treated.
Right. So 5 months in Catterick, and we then talked about your move across to Bielefeld and subsequently to Munster. Did any of the soldiers arriving with you have any idea which regiment they were going to end up at?
No, at Bielefeld, no one knew which regiment they were going to until you paraded at 4 o'clock that morning and you were told where you were going.
Wow.
And once again, the NCO, who was a sergeant, was not a very pleasant guy.
So you arrived in Munster, and you've already explained that. Obviously, it's a short couple of years after the war had finished that Munster was flattened. So, what about the camp? Did the camp survive?
The camp was very good, and obviously the barracks, ex-German military barracks, were very, very superior to the ones that we'd experienced in England, because we were all in these. I think it was 20-soldier wooden huts in those days, and we were quite impressed by the standard of the barracks. Most of them were probably 6 or 7 soldiers per barracks. Some of them were 3 or 4, depending where you were. As I say, we were in A Squadron. Charlie Gower was the sergeant major, who was a real character throughout my term serving in the army. He was an ex-Rough Rider in the Skins years and years ago. Quite a character. And Tommy Hudson, he was the drill sergeant. Now, Tommy was, once again, a very old skin. He was also one of the rough riding crew in the Skins before the war. But he was a real old-fashioned, good sergeant, and he treated us very good.
When you say Rough Rider, is this part of the... I know the Skins had a sort of trick ride,
yes,
which became very famous.
Yes.
So the Rough Riders were part of that organisation?
Yes, they were. We had the... what's the word I want? The horse jumping teams, which
Right.
were mostly officers. But on the Rough Riders, then, as I say, I knew Charlie and Tommy were 2 of those, and they reflected it in their character.
Right. So there's still, at that time, much talk about pre-mechanisation and the love of the horses, which, of course, is something that's forgotten sometimes.
Yes.
Right. What is your you mentioned briefly before that the routine in Munster was there was some foot drill and some other training. I'm assuming the tanks were the same sort of tanks, the Chaffies? Or...
No. The tanks in Munster were Cromwells and Comets.
Right.
And we had also delivered later in 48 the first Mark I Centurion. And the distinctive difference between the Mark I and later Centurions was the Mark I was what we called a welded turret. This was plate welded turret, which wasn't very successful as I understand, but bear in mind I didn't know much about tanks in those days. So it was Comets and Cromwells mostly what we drove.
Right. So obviously quite a bit of diversity then, having been trained on one tank and then having to flit to other tanks. So I take it was almost a constant sort of training regime that was going on.
Yes. Well, as I said, on the old American chassis, it was a semi-automatic gearbox, which was a simple thing. But then we came to a manual gearbox, and in those days, they were what we call crash gearbox, where you had to drop the revs, double the clutch, rev up, put you in gear sort of thing. But as I say, I think my interest was there because this is what I wanted to do. And so I took great interest in learning to drive. But also I was a radio operator, which wasn't my scene. But they wanted me, and they did. They made me train on radio, mostly the 19 and B set, Morse code. I think I got up to about 10 words a minute, but I struggled with that.
Right. So
I didn't really like it.
Okay. Now, obviously the Cold War hadn't sort of been talked about at this stage. It wasn't the Cold War. What was the role of the regiment? Was it purely occupational force?
In Munster?
Yes.
Yes. I'm not too sure. Bear in mind I was a young soldier, so I didn't really know the whole function of the regiment. I was just tied up in A Squadron, and whatever A Squadron did, that was it. I think, with respect, I think the regiment was a little bit lax in discipline. Some of the soldiers walked about not properly dressed and things like that, which amazed me because being in the Ox and Bucks, they were very regimental. But it wasn't that bad. But one thing that did strike me was there was a small copse right in the middle of the barracks, I suppose of about 30 trees and probably a quarter acre of ground. And one day a Russian party came in and started digging. And evidently there was several Russian officers who'd been shot by the Germans, had been buried there. Wow. And they were exhuming them to take them back to Russia. But there was no precaution about the smell, and it was quite sickening. It spread all across the camp for several days.
So they actually found the bodies?
Oh, yes. Yes,
right.
Yeah. But that was one instance that, once again, it brought to mind just what did happen there. Security was very strict on guard. Bear in mind the Germans were very austere. They had no food, no heating, nothing. And one of our guards was the coal dump, where we had a large heap of coke and solid fuel. And this was one of the priorities where you had to guard it. And on several occasions, we had to set about on Germans who cut through the fence to pinch the fuel. And on one occasion, one of them was actually shot. One of the guard, because we had live ammunition in those days on guard, and one of the intruders was shot. But that was one of the things that happened there.
Right. What was the relationship like between yourselves and the German population? I mean, was there much contact with them?
There wasn't a terrible lot of contact, but it was very, very harsh. Bear in mind, Munster had been shelled and bombed to total destruction. And as I'm aware, I'm not too sure, but as I'm aware, the Skins was involved in the capture of Munster. But this was what the story goes, and this is why we were told by our seniors that be careful if you go into Munster, because there is that aggro feeling between the population and our regiment. We used to go into Munster just to walk round. There was a couple of photography places where they were dying to take your photograph, which we had done for a packet of fags and things like that. But other than that, the only other place of entertainment outside the camp was a bar just up the road from the camp, and soldiers used to go there and drink schnapps to relieve their boredom, I suppose.
Right.
But other than that, that was about all there was.
Right. The composition of the regiment, I'm assuming at this stage in 1947 that quite a few of the perhaps senior NCOs and officers were those who fought from D-Day through to where the regiment finished up in the sort of Hamburg area. Would that be right?
Well, from what I know of it, I do know that there's a village on the Dutch-German border where the regiment relieved the village there. I went there some time ago and we were welcomed there. But coming back to the senior NCO situation, there were several who did remain in the regiment, Johnny Searle and several more who I knew, but there were quite a few who were demob happy and they were going out on demob after they'd done their service, which obviously, as you'll see later, left lots of vacancies for young guys like myself.
Right, so you've painted the picture of Munster being almost totally destroyed, the life in the camp, or the camp itself, being actually not that bad compared with what was back in the UK. So daily routine, not daily routine, but did you go on exercise a lot? Was there a chance to train on the tanks?
I did one or two short exercises, but it was rather vague because you were put on this job, but no one seemed to tell you what it was all about, what the objective was, which I found later, which I'll explain to you when we went to Korea, that there seemed to be a lack of communication between the senior people and the trooper.
Right. And that sort of carried on throughout your time or your early days in Munster. Yes,
that carried on. I think, as I say, I did do my course on driver operator and passed out on that, if you can call it passed out. They said, yeah, that's all right, you're okay. And then going into the middle of 48, this is when I got my first tape. This was on recommendation from Tommy Hudson, the old drill sergeant. And from there, it was just routine.
Right.
Nothing exciting about it.
Right. When did the regiment move from Munster? Because I believe you then moved off to Paderborn.
Yeah, we moved.
Right.
We moved off. If I remember rightly, it could have been early 49, late 48, early 49. I've got to be honest, I'm not quite sure.
Okay. Was that a welcome move, do you think? Did people look to move on from Munster?
I think it was, because we moved from York Barracks in Munster to Barker Barracks in Paderborn, and once again, I think the standard of the camp and the facilities were much better. After moving into Paderborn, early in the year I was sent on a course, once again a driving course only, and I went to a camp at Bergen-Belsen, which was just outside Celle, and this camp was part of, or just below, the concentration camp at Belsen. We did, I think it was 8 weeks there, and that's when I met the future Sergeant Major for C Squadron Training Block, Joe Precious. He was in the Cherry Pickers, the 11th Hussars,
right. And
he was the Sergeant Major training school at Bergen-Belsen. And after doing that course, I returned to Barker Barracks, Paderborn, followed by Joe Precious, and I was then at the end of 49, I was sent to Bovington on a D&M course.
That's driving and maintenance.
Yeah.
Right. So it's pretty rapid, really. I mean, you got promotion very quickly. I think you said you touched earlier that because of the rotation of people coming through and people being demobbed, that promotion was very quick.
Well, I did that course in 49. I returned to the regiment and was made a corporal.
Excellent.
My first job as a corporal D&M instructor was to come to England with one officer, and we went to Catterick and we picked up a group of 40 men to take back to the regiment. We took those 40 men back to the regiment, and I was in charge of those 40 men for their whole training period.
Well, was that normal at the time for other regiments as well? It's just
yes,
you pick up your soldiers and bring them across?
Because we were becoming a training regiment.
Right.
It was necessary that we fulfilled our training programs, and the normal amount of pickup from Catterick was about 40 men. I always remember when we got back to the station in London, and I had the guys on parade. I said, "Now, some of you live near London, but I don't want you absconding." But we did lose 2 men on one occasion. Anyway, that's by the way. When we got back to camp, I was totally in charge of those 40 men for basic training, which was drill. Okay. Then they would do 1 week fatigues, and then they would be split into groups for skills training. That was wireless, gunnery, tanks, and transport. And those 40 men would probably be split up into groups of 5 or 6 for each course. So I would take, we'll say, 6 men on D&M. The wireless corporal or sergeant would take some on wireless. The gunnery guy would take them on gunnery. And the transport men would be in with the tank drivers. But when it came to tank driving, they would be separate and just do B vehicles.
Right.
Now that would take 2 weeks classroom, 2 weeks practical, 2 weeks classroom, 4 weeks driving. So that's 10 weeks.
Right.
About 10 weeks.
And was this was the whole regiment involved in training, or was just a particular
just
squadron?
C squadron.
Right.
Just C squadron.
And what were the other squadron, A, B squadron, doing at the time?
There was no B squadron at that point in time.
Right. So
It was A squadron, C squadron, HQ.
right. So what was A squadron doing then? I mean, I take it they were sort of obviously.
They were Sabre squadron.
Sabre squadron. Right.
They would go out on manoeuvres, mostly up to Vogelsang. That's where the tank training took place, as you probably know. At HQ squadron, obviously, they would be involved in the same type of thing. And this would then leave a skeleton crew in camp, and then we used to have to look after the security and the training in camp while they were away.
And just to make sure I've got this right, so the at that time, these were the Centurion tanks that you had.
Yes, we were on Mark II Centurions then. Yes, yeah, I forgot to tell you that.
Yeah.
The old Mark I was not successful, and I think we left it at Munster. I'm not sure.
Right.
Bear in mind, I was not really aware of what was going on in those days. But we were then into the Mark II Centurion, which everybody thought was the bee's knees of the armoured vehicles, and they were. But my training, I think I will tell you later on, I was one of the senior sergeants at the end of the training period, and I used to train on Centurions. We had a Comet and a Cromwell, which the CO used to use as a scout car, more or less. And so I used to teach Centurion, B vehicles, Comet and Cromwell. We only had one of each of those, and also the Dingo scout car. So I had quite a various amount of different training vehicles, which I enjoyed, of course.
That's fascinating. I'm getting a picture now. The regiment wasn't actually that big. You had one Sabre squadron and effectively a training squadron.
I think a B squadron was coming into being then. I'm not quite sure because I was wrapped up in training. I was blind to everything else that was going on. I was focused on training because, as I told you, if you remember, I was never going to be respectful to young men, and I focused on doing just that. And I did have some good results. Then 1950 came along, and I was promoted to sergeant. Not me alone. I think on regimental orders that night, I think there was 8 of us made up to corporal to sergeant in one hit. Unbelievable, really. Well, when I look back and talk to people like yourself, how long it took to get promotion, it was just one of those things. But we were obviously a training regiment. You had to have senior NCOs in training. Lots of the guys during the war were leaving anyway, and it was just a good opportunity.
Very, very different days, indeed. So the 40 men you had in C Squadron, once they finished their effectively 10 weeks training or their training, I take it then they went off to fill the Sabre squadrons.
What happened, when we finished the training period, it then became their test. They used to take a written test, simple written test on vehicle maintenance, what oils you used and things like that. Very basic written test. Then they would be given, if they were going to become a tank driver, they were given a driving test on a tank, not by the instructor but by another instructor. If they were to be a radio, then they were given a radio test, gunnery test, and also if they were going into transport, they were given a B vehicle test. And most of them passed out. It was a new world for these national servicemen, and once they got into the training on vehicles, they got that interest into them and they took note. And there was very, very, very few who dropped out.
Right. So, just looking back so far, you joined in 47 and here you are in 1950, probably just under 3 years later. You're a sergeant, and you've been responsible for teaching drill, probably 4 different types of armoured vehicle. That's quite a progression. I mean, did you feel under any pressure at the time? Was it all going a bit too fast for you, or did you just cope with it?
No, I really enjoyed it. I really did. I volunteered, and I was determined to do whatever I had to do, and I enjoyed doing everything. But during the later period of 49-50, things did change. We had a new RSM come in from the Guards, John Besley.
And why did he come from the Guards? I mean, that's sort of unheard of today, but I'm sure there was a very good reason.
I think there was a problem somewhere, but I wasn't to know anyway.
Right.
So we had John Besley coming in as RSM, who was a typical Guardsman RSM. No respect for his sergeants. Not a very nice man. But don't.
And which Guards?
I don't know.
Was he
I
from?
don't know.
Right, okay.
Then we had Johnny Hobart, captain, come in from the Guards. He came in as adjutant. Once again, a typical Guardsman. Very strict discipline. Then we had Guy Watham, another captain, come in from the Guards. He went into a Sabre squadron, so I didn't know much about him.
Right. So,
We had Dick Hollington, a sergeant. He came in as a drill sergeant, and a very, very good drill sergeant he was, and he was very respectful to his men, but he was a very, very good drill sergeant. We had a corporal by the name of Wilson, Tug Wilson, who was not a very nice character, which you'll find out later on. And we had 2 or 3 lance corporals come in from the Guards, but I didn't know them.
Right. Now, I know you were focused on, obviously, with the amount of work that's been thrown your way, very focused on what you were doing at that time. Have you any idea what the other armoured regiments stationed around Germany were doing at the time? Were they all in a sort of similar structure with training squadrons and
Yes,
that sort of thing?
I think they were. The nearest armoured regiment, I think, was at Detmold. I'm not quite sure what regiment, I can't remember what regiment it was. But I think, yes, because they used to rotate the training areas for gunnery and Vogelsang and things like that. One regiment would move in and another one moved out. But as I say, I wasn't involved in that side thing, I was just focused on training.
Right. What about the food in the camp? What was that like in those days?
The food in the other ranks, corporal's mess and other ranks, was pretty basic. We had so much fish for meals that we called the sergeant Fishy West because he was a Sergeant West. But it was quite a reasonable standard, not terrible.
And it was 3 meals a day, so...
Yes, yeah.
Right. And was this provided by army chefs?
Yes, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, sergeant in charge was a Sergeant West in the catering corps, and then he had a couple of corporals, lance corporal, and a few other guys to do general duties. But other than that, I didn't know much about the mess, as I say, because when we moved to Paderborn, I was a corporal, and I dined in the corporal section of the same other ranks mess.
Right.
So it's the same food, but we were in a separate area.
Excellent. And what about in the evenings? Did you have sort of like a club?
I think in the evenings it could be quite boring. There were cinema shows. There was a cinema. There was dancing lessons. Alan Claydon, Sergeant Claydon, he was quite a good dancer. He used to take dancing lessons and teach us how to dance. WVS area. We used to run bingo once a week, but we used to take that off our own bat. We used to run the bingo for all the other ranks. Other than that, I think really that was about it.
And was there ample opportunity to play sports if you were a sporting sort of person?
Yeah. There was always plenty of encouragement to play sports. As I told you, Peter Duckworth, Captain Duckworth at the time, he used to encourage it. There was fencing lessons. Lots of basketball was played, football, rugby. We used to do inter-sergeant officers' mess rugby about twice a year. That used to be a bit of a bloody bath.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So yes, it was there if you wanted to do it, but there wasn't a lot of it, put it that way.
Did the regiment celebrate St Patrick's Day?
Oh yes.
Yes, that was a big day in the calendar.
Yeah, we had Patrick's Parade every March. That was always a big parade. When Johnny Hobart came from the Guards as a captain adjutant, he had an adjutant's parade every Saturday, first Saturday of the month, Saturday morning, early parade. And one of the things that used to not only get up the sergeant's noses, because he would inspect, then he would fall out the officers, fall out the warrant officers, and then he would double march the whole squad, the whole regiment round the parade ground to da 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 for about 20 minutes. We could never understand it why, because of course we always had the band on parade for that occasion. But that was a routine, and it really used to get up our nose because you would see the Germans on the sideline watching, and I think they wondered what the hell was going on.
I'm sure they did. Yeah, and so working on a Saturday. That was just. Did you work Saturday all Saturday mornings?
Oh no,
it's just that one Saturday a month.
No. Right. Unless it was a special duty or something. Obviously, we had a CO's parade now and again, but that wasn't too often, because I think the adjutant's parade was enough for anybody, really.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah. Now, what about families? Were any of the wives joining the husbands at this stage?
Oh yes, yeah. There was there were several married families in the camp. As I said, the block below what was C Squadron, there was flats above there, even though there was military below. And in the building, which I'm not quite sure what the number of it was on the left as you went through the old guardroom gate. There were several married families in there, and there was quite a lot of married officers' quarters outside the camp in private buildings.
Right. So basically, if you weren't an officer and you were married, you could have your wife, but in camp, but living above the soldiers.
No, not officers.
No, I mean, other than officers.
The other ranks, up to and including sergeant majors.
Did that cause any problems that you remember? I mean, having wives in the blocks.
I think it's
that
not.
We can talk about.
I think it's best not to talk about that.
Yeah.
Obviously, there were one or two occasions, but it was always kept as quiet as possible.
Excellent. So life goes on. Obviously, lots of sports going on. Conditions obviously vastly improved, perhaps from Munster, and certainly from what you experienced in the UK.
Yes.
And you mentioned that you were promoted to sergeant. What was life like as a young sergeant at that time?
Well, I think, as I explained to you, we had a RSM come from the Guards, who was rather strict with young sergeants. I think he appreciated the wartime sergeants, the old hands, but he used to take it out on the young sergeants a little bit. And when we used to get in the mess, you were never allowed to call him by a Christian name. It was always Sir or Mr Besley, which was surprising, because I do know that I spoke to other sergeants from other regiments and messes, and once their RSM came into the mess, it was John, Joe or whatever. And as a fine example, when I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but when we were designated to go to Korea, John Besley all of a sudden disappeared from the regiment, and we had a new RSM come in from Chester.
Right.
I'm trying to think of his name. George. Oh, it'll come to me later. But his first name was George,
right.
And I always remember distinctly. We went into the mess on the first night, and it was always procedures, to offer the new RSM a drink. And I said to him, Mr. I'll think of his name in a minute.
Sure.
Can I buy you a drink? He said, the name is George, while we're in the mess. And that struck me as very, very different to what we were used to.
I'm sure. And what was life like in the sergeant's mess?
It was very good. We had a mess night once a month, which was blues or uniforms, not civilians. The food was very good, and there was quite a good snooker room, table tennis. So yes, if you wanted to go in the mess at night time, and of course, plenty to drink.
Yeah, but always helps. Yeah.
When you're bored.
Right. Now you mentioned obviously we're getting closer to Korea. were you aware of what was happening worldwide at that time?
I think the worldwide news was pretty scarce. Bear in mind, it was difficult to have or afford a radio. I had an old radio knocked up, but I could only get a few local stations on that. And even though we vaguely heard about Korea, we took no notice of it because it was the other side of the world, and really we thought it didn't concern us. We didn't even know which regiment was out there, because I think you remember, even though the war had started, the 8th Royal Irish Hussars didn't go out there until about 5 months after the war had started. So really our regiments weren't that much involved. And the only reason I think they went, because they were at the time, I think, stationed in Singapore or Hong Kong, one of the two. And they were nearest regiment to the conflict.
And when did you find out, and how was it announced that you were going to Korea?
Well, going on from that, in Christmas 1950, I was on leave, and I'd arranged my marriage to my girlfriend then, Peggy, to be married in June, because in case you're not aware, every soldier was allowed 3 weeks leave every 6 months from Germany, and I was fortunate that my leave used to start in 3 weeks in June and 3 weeks in December, because I joined the regiment in December, so I was lucky to have Christmas every time.
Right.
Well, as I say, I was home in Christmas 50, and we'd arranged our marriage for June the 23rd of 51. And when I got back from leave, early in 51, the commanding officer, who was Colonel Carr at the time, called the regiment together and informed us that we'd been nominated to go to Korea at the end of the year to relieve the 8th Royal Irish Hussars. On hearing this, I wrote to my future wife and said, the situation is that even though we're planning to marry in June, I should be going to Korea October after that June. Do you still want to go ahead with the wedding? She said, I don't really know. So I booked a flight. I got leave. I explained to the squadron leader, who was Peter Martel, Captain Martel, about the situation. He gave me leave, and I booked a flight from Germany to England, went home. We sat down and discussed the situation. And I said, there's two sensible ways to look at it. If I go out there and we're not married and I get killed, you get nothing. I said, if we marry, you'll get family allowance while I'm away, marriage allowance while I'm away, and if I get killed, you'll get widow's allowance. So we've only got one option, we'll get married. And she thought that was a good financial deal, so we went through with it.
Excellent. So you got married 23rd of June 1951.
That's right.
And then a few months later, I'm assuming there's quite a bit of training, pre-training before you deployed?
Sorry?
A lot of pre-training
Yes,
before you deployed?
Well, as I say, when I got back off leave from my wedding, that was my big disappointment, because during the time I was on leave, I got back early July, I was informed that I'd been transferred from C Squadron to B Squadron. Right. And worse still, not as a tank commander, but as transport sergeant. So I had an interview with Peter Martel, the then squadron leader of C Squadron, and I explained to him that I considered I had a right to say in C Squadron, being as I was one of the senior sergeants there. And he said there was a meeting, and it was decided at that meeting that you would be posted to B Squadron, and I couldn't do anything about it. So I reported to B Squadron, and Mike Tompkin, Major Tompkin was squadron leader. Bill Garnett was second IC. Now, Bill Garnett was well known for not liking training NCOs. He always used to say, those bloody NCOs from that training wing. So that was a good start. Anyway, I asked for an interview, and I had an interview with Mike Tompkin, and I said I was disappointed that one, I was transferred from my own squadron to a new squadron, and B, not to be a tank commander, but a transport sergeant. He used the words quite straightforward. He said, "You disappoint me because I asked for you especially knowing your knowledge of B vehicles. And we know we got lots of problems in Korea with B vehicles, and that's why you're there." So I said, okay, sir, I accept what you're saying. The only thing I would request is I get into Korea and I get your transport troop going right, and I can get someone to swap places with me from a Sabre troop to transport. Will you let it go ahead? And he said, yes, I will do that. So that was the agreement. From there, we had an intake from many regiments. They were classified as volunteers, but I'm sure a lot of them were pushed because I think you know what some of the transport troops are like. And I had a rough old bunch, I can assure you.
Yeah, it seems to be the way.
But we knocked them into shape, and they turned out to be quite a good troop. I think they understood what I intended to do and what I wanted. I only had one who went on the run, so I think I had a troop of about 15 men, a full corporal, Jimmy Wells, and a lance corporal. They were both from the skins anyway, and I knew them both quite well, so that was all right. And we did some manoeuvre training, night driving, lagering up, camping out, cooking their own meals, all that sort of thing, which one would expect to go on training. And then when the first RTR came into barracks to take over, we signed off all the kit, and then we had about 2 weeks free time.
Right.
They took over all the duties, and we were just enjoying ourselves.
That's brilliant. And so one RTR took over the camp from you, so it was always the case that you were never going to be returning to Barker Barracks. Is that the case, or?
No.
Right.
No.
Okay. Now, before we move on towards Korea, there's one area I'd like to talk about, and that is the Nignogs.
The what?
Nignogs.
Oh, right.
Which is a wonderful.
Yeah.
Having done a bit of reading on this, it comes up all the time. Probably not very PC these days, but so the national servicemen were called Nignogs.
Yeah.
How many of your troop, your MT or your transport troop, were national servicemen or Nignogs?
Most of them were regular soldiers.
Right.
But I think one thing that would be very, very important to register, when we heard that we were going to Korea, and as you know, at that period of time, national service was increased from 18 months to 2 years, we had quite a number of Nignogs whose time would not allow them to go to Korea, even though the extra 6 months were added on. In other words, if they had less than a year to serve, they would not necessarily go to Korea. And when a lot of them heard of this, we had a very high percentage of national servicemen sign on to do the Korean adventure, which I thought expressed what I said to you before, that a lot of national servicemen who did join and were reluctant to start with signed on in the army anyway, because they found life wasn't as bad as it was in Civvy Street. But it was very encouraging to see these young men decide to sign on and come to Korea with us.
Well, that's nice to hear. And I believe the Nignogs actually had their own sort of regimental magazine at one stage.
Yes, they did. I might have a copy of one of them somewhere. If I have, I'll look it up and let you have it. But I'm not too sure. Yes, where Nignog come from, I do not know. Whether whether it's the abbreviation for something, I don't know. But it came in all of a sudden, and where it came from, I don't know.
I mean, the fact that they actually produced their own sort of regimental magazine gives an indication that there was this divide between those who were regular soldiers in the regiment and those who were national service. Was there a big sort of rift between these two groups?
Definitely not. No, I think national servicemen and regular soldiers got on as well as anything else. There was never any punch-ups or anything. Those who didn't like national service used to say to the regular soldier, "You must be mad." But other than that, no. Everything was quite smooth.
Excellent. So here we are then. We're all getting ready for this great adventure. How did you... What was happening in the last couple of months leading up to deploying to Korea? Did you deploy from Germany, or did you deploy from UK?
No. What happened... Once we were all well aware of what was going to happen, and we knew the RTR was coming in to take over, we were very busy, as you can imagine, getting all the kit up to strength. It was a job to find all the correct toolkits for each vehicle. You're probably aware you used to lay all the tools out in front of each vehicle. What we used to do was when they were expecting one and he went up, we took something from there and put it there to make the kit up. But it went very well, and the RTR were quite good with us. They mucked in. They were good in the mess with us, and we ended up very friendly. When the time came for us to leave barracks, obviously an advance party had gone ahead to get into Aldershot in the barracks where we were moving into. But the whole regiment moved down to Paderborn Station, and the train was waiting for us, and how do I explain it? Some of the regiments who had been friends of ours laid out the whole length of the platform, as much eats and drinks as you wanted to have. Bottles of whiskey, brandy, gin, food, you name it, and it was all spread out along the platform. And when we got there, they just said, "Help yourself."
So obviously a really good relationship with the other units in the garrison.
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice to hear.
Yeah. Anyway, we got on the train and travelled to the Hook of Holland, and from there we boarded the old rust tubs that used to take us across the North Sea to Harwich, and then from Harwich we I think, I can't remember. I think we all lorried down to Aldershot. I'm sure we did, yes.
Right.
And we went in these old barracks. The pre-war, not pre-war, the First World War barracks, where you had stables below, iron steps outside to the barrack room above the stables. So we were in there. The sergeant had a little cubicle, and all the men had the large barrack room. And we were there for, what are we talking, August, until we went up to Liverpool in November.
Right, so a couple of months up there then.
Yeah. What did we do in Aldershot? Most of it was bullshit parades. No information on how we were going to get to Korea or what boat we were going on. No information about Korea itself. We were all very, very vague. And of course, everyone had to take so much leave. Everybody was due embarkation leave. So we all had to plan how many men could get away. For 4 weeks I was acting sergeant major. And then I took my leave, and then when we got back, we paraded very early in the morning, trained up to Liverpool, and to our amazement we were boarded onto the Georgic, which was a cruise ship commandeered by the government for transportation of troops and supplies to Korea. So we were all in cabins on the cruise out. That took, I think, almost 6 weeks. 5 to 6 weeks. I can't be sure of the dates, but I do know we landed in Busan mid-December.
Did you know before you left UK how long you were going for?
We knew we had to do a year's service in Korea, but we didn't know future from that.
What are your sort of 6 weeks to get from Liverpool to Busan?
Almost 6 weeks, yes.
Right. What was life like on ship?
It was, I think on hindsight, we lacked information. We obviously had parades, mostly bullshit parades. We obviously did PT exercises every day, and we did different things. But one of the things in hindsight was we were never told what Korea was all about. We didn't know the climate, we didn't know the terrain, we didn't know the people, we didn't know the suffering of the troops out there. In particular, of course, the Gloucesters who had a terrible battle out there. And when I look back, I felt it would have been much more beneficial had we had someone, bear in mind we'd already sent an advance party to Korea in the early year. They went out there about 6 months before we did. In fact, Gavin Murray, Captain Murray, won an MC in the Gloucester Valley because he was a tank commander there. Now, it would have been very wise had they shipped him back to us, yes, to travel with us, to talk to us and tell us what to expect. I mean, we didn't know we were going to live under canvas. We didn't know the hazards of tanks out there in frozen weather and wet weather and dusty weather. So we had to learn as we went along.
Right. So you arrived in... But I'm sorry, before we move on to Busan, I mean, apart from the parades, I mean, accommodation on the ship, food, was it sort of
very
comfortable?
Good.
Or
yes,
was there a lot of seasickness?
Because it was all private stewards and private catering, you see.
Oh, okay.
We did some arms, small arms firing off the back of the boat, Bren gun, Sten gun. We used to toss a 50-gallon drum off the back of the boat and shoot it up. We did a bit of that. Obviously we did a bit of arms drill, but other than that, it was
right,
very lacking, I would say.
Yeah. So armed with a complete lack of understanding of what you're about to embark into. What happened when you actually arrived in Korea?
Well, when we got to Busan, we had an American band marching on the quayside welcoming us. We called them Snowdrops because they all had white helmets on and playing the old Yankee jazz stuff. We were issued with khaki drill uniforms for travelling out, and then when we got to Korea, we were issued with Arctic kit, which was special trousers, special boots. When you ordered a pair of boots, you ordered 2 sizes over because you used to wear copper netting insoles inside, because you would sometimes sleep in these and it stopped your feet sweating or whatever it was. And we were also issued with a parka, which was a heavy waterproof parka with with a beaver tail which you could pull up between your legs and stud up in front of you, and a big fur hood over the top. When we got there, we had to pack our battle dress uniform in the kit bag and other webbing and kit. I must tell you about the webbing in a moment. When we were issued this, don't pack your greatcoat. And as we went by, we threw all our greatcoats onto a big pile. Why, I don't know. So that was it. We got on the train, Busan station, and just wooden seats. The train went about 10 miles an hour, I think. I think it took us about over 24 hours to get from Busan up to Seoul, which was our station of arrival. So that was quite a traumatic experience.
What was the weather like when you arrived?
When we arrived there, it was cold, but not very cold. There was no snow, but it was typical start of winter. Could I just go back about webbing equipment? I forgot to tell you that. When we were designated, or the commanding officer changed, I'm not quite sure what it was, but it was decided that we would go back to blancoed equipment. We tried to hand all the black equipment into the ministry stores, and they wouldn't accept it. So we had to scrub off all the boot polish, black boot polish, everything, large pack, small pack, holster, belt, webbing, you name it. They issued us with soda and hot water and benches. We had to scrub all the black polish off. And you know, when you scrub webbing, it goes stiff. And getting behind the brasses and everything, a hell of a job. But we managed it in the end, and then we had to blanco it all again. But that was halfway through the Paderborn station. Anyway, that's just a point of interest.
Madness.
Right, when we got to Seoul, it was then designated where each squadron was going to go. Because of the 8th Royal Irish Hussars, each squadron was in a separate zone. There was 2 squadrons in line, 1 squadron in 1st Reserve, 1 squadron in 2nd Reserve. No, 1 squadron in the line, 1 in 1st Reserve, 1 in 2nd Reserve, and HQ squadron. Right. 1st Reserve was about 4 miles behind the front line, which was about a mile north of the Imjin River. 2nd Reserve was south of the Imjin River, and they used to be stationed in what was then known as the Gloucester Valley, because that was the largest flat area in the area where we were, and HQ was permanently in another place. When a squadron was in the front line, you would have 1st, 2nd, 3rd and 4th troop, 4 troops to the squadron, and they were stationed approximately perhaps a mile apart at different hilltops. So you were within walking distance or B-set communications if you wanted to, and the troop leader, as I say, when I got transferred to a Sabre squad troop, Mike Fain, he would obviously walk right through every morning and take me with him because I was the 1st sergeant for the troop. Johnny Dunn was 2nd sergeant, and Bruff, I can't remember his first name, he was a corporal. He was in the other tank. Every day when the weather was favourable, one troop was allowed to go down to the Imjin River and have a good bathe or wash if it was warm enough. Obviously we couldn't do that in the winter, but in the winter, the Americans used to transport a mobile shower unit, which was a large troop tent, you know, the ones that used to sleep about 20 men. And they set up this mobile shower unit, and you'd go in there and have a shower and change of clothes. That was about once a week per troop, so that was a shower every 4 weeks or something like that.
God.
For my first frontline place was a non-organised area. There were no bunkers there, nothing at all. It was a new position. It was 800 yards from the opposite, from the North Korean lines, across the valley, and the range was 800 yards. Wasn't allowed to fire a shot. When we got there, we had to dig our own bunkers. We had to cut down trees to roof over the top of the bunkers, put soil on the top of the trees, tarpaulin over the top to make it waterproof, and then soil on the top of that. So we had to sleep in the open for about 4 or 5 days or more while we dug the bunkers. And I had to have a separate bunker. Each troop leader, each troop sergeant or corporal had to sleep separate from his crew. So it meant digging 2 bunkers. And we did that, and we stayed there for, I think, I went up there in March, April, came back in May. Never fired a shot, never saw a gook. We used to watch them all day across the valley.
So there you were on top of this hill, mountain. Would you call it a hill or a mountain? Or is it
no, these were hills. I think the name of my hill was 223.
Right. And how far were you from the other troops then?
Well,
because if each troop was on top of a hill.
Yeah, well, there were lots of mounds. You know, it was very hilly country.
Yeah.
The tallest mountain in Korea was Mount Kamaksan, and that was just above Gloucester Valley, and that was where all the main radio stations were. So I was about 100 yards from my troop leader. Johnny Dunn was about 200 yards from me, and Bruff was about 100 yards from him. So we were spread out at the most advantageous observation place.
Right. So all right. So your individual tanks within the troop were spread out, sort of, quite a large distance.
Yeah, and also, of course, not only digging our own bunkers in this first place we went to, we had to dig our tanks turret down, so we could drive into turret down for observation. So there was a lot of digging to do. And of course, sometimes you start digging, you get halfway through, and you'd hit solid rock. So you had to fill in and start somewhere else. So it was certainly an experience.
And did you have line communication, wire communication with your opposite or troops?
No, we on the first visit to the front line, no, we just communicated with verbal, walking, or by B-set. And of course, there was one tank on radio watch 24 hours a day. So if I did 24 hours, Johnny Dunn would do the next, and so on. So we were always in touch with HQ.
How did you get the tanks up there? I'm visualising these very steep-sided hills. Was it a problem getting the tanks into position?
Yeah, the first time I went up to this position, I lost a track going up. And if you know what a problem is, if you lose a track on a steep hill, it's one hell of a problem. But I managed to get it back on all right. What we did in this occasion, we sort of walked up the hill several ways to find out which we thought was the best track. But you never knew what was under the ground. You could walk up and it looked good, and the tank would sink in, hit a lump of rock and throw you sideways, and you could slide down the hill or something like that. In fact, we did in the winter, and there are photographs of it. We did lose a tank where it was Jack McGee's tank. He was going up the front line to relieve another troop. They were due to come back into reserve, and he went up this normal track, and the ground was frozen solid, and he hit a little hillock. The tank slid sideways down the hill. The Gooks used to bury their dead in big mounds on the side of the hills. They'd cut a platform out, sit the dead body on a chair, and then build a big mound round it. Well, his tank slid down, hit this mound, and pitch-bowled down the hill. And the gun was like a corkscrew when he hit the bottom, but nobody was injured. But that was one instance. So that was my first experience in the front line.
So not real tank country then?
Oh, there was 3 problems. In the winter, if you dare move your tank without great caution, you could lose it. It was the only time that we did swans up into the valley, except in the midsummer. And what we used to have to do was test the paddy fields to see if the ice was strong enough to take the weight of a tank. I'll come to that later because I had to do that. Otherwise, it meant keeping to the tracks to swan into enemy lines. And of course, the tracks were mined anyway. So it was pretty fruitless. The other time was in the early summer, after the heavy rains. The roads were just a mass of mud, and then they dried out, and you had about 6 inches of just dust like flour. And as you know, the exhaust from the tanks and the air always come out the back and hit the ground behind. That used to send clouds of dust up you couldn't see for miles. And then in the wet season, you had to be careful because of the floods. So, you know, it wasn't tank country. We did swans, and as you know, later on when we won the Battle Honour on the Hook with Mike, the officer who got an MC, I'll think of his name in a minute, they did a good job there on the Hook of Holland. And I think over the year we probably did about 4 or 5 swans. We used to call it swans into enemy lines. And the main thing was to go in and wipe out some of their OP posts and things like that. But not terribly successful.
Right. So when you did the swans, I take it you were from the reserve squadron, so you still have the tanks on the hillsides.
Oh yes,
yes, right.
Yeah, they would obviously observe where the swan was taking place. But I never took part in one of those, so I was lucky I didn't get caught up in that.
It's quite intriguing. Tell me about your experience of testing the ice to see if a tank, the ice was strong enough to take a tank.
As you know, I come back out the front line. I'd been on leave. I'd been back in the front line again, and then I came back into First Reserve, and my tank was a Mark II, and it was worn out, and I was due a new tank, which was going to be the new Mark III. And Mike Tompkins had a directive to test the paddy field ice to see if it would stand the weight of a tank. So he called me in and he said, Sergeant Bellinger, I want you to drive your old tank, which is, if it sinks, it don't matter. I said, what about me? He said, you'll have to get out quick. He said, I want you to drive, because we were right next to paddy fields all over the place. I want you to drive your tank slowly onto the ice to see what happens. So I said, well, I won't let my driver do it, I'll drive it. Johnny Dunn could sit on the turret and tell me what was happening if I couldn't see anything. So we got it all lined up. As I told you, Bill Garnett was 2IC, and we had a Captain Williams out of the 1st RTR stationed with us, who was the tech officer. So I said, before we drive onto the thing, I want to anchor the tank onto a ARV with his spuds down and let the cable out gently as I drive forward.
Onto a recovery vehicle?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So he said, what do you want to go to all that trouble for? I said, the trouble is we might lose a tank and you might lose me. And it's a safeguard. Anyway, I had an argument with both these captains. Because I will admit, I used to stick up for myself a bit. Anyway, I won the day because Mike Tompkins said it's a good idea. So we anchored up, we drove forward very gently. About half the tank was on the ice, and the pressure obviously was great. And the weakest part of the frost was about 10 yards in front of the tank in the paddy field. There was a weak spot. So all the pressure went there, and you know what paddy fields are full of, don't you?
Yeah.
Human waste, and black as your hat. And all of a sudden, like a geyser, it all shot up in the air. That must have shot up 40 feet or more. All black mud and dirt. Ugh. And then, as the tank went forward a bit more, the ice cracked and it started to go down. So they anchored me up and I reversed out. So it wasn't satisfactory to drive the tanks on the paddy fields.
I mean, the mind boggles, because obviously the idea was to test the way for perhaps an advance across the ice.
Yeah.
With a squadron of tanks. Yeah, that's...
Yeah, because I think the reason being, it was good logic, because the enemy wouldn't expect tanks to go forward across paddy fields. But if the paddy fields had been secure enough to do it, mind you, there's paddy fields and paddy fields, isn't there?
Yes, yes.
But that was the idea of it anyway.
Right.
But it was a failure, so that was that.
Right. So obviously you've mentioned a couple of times that you've had leave, you've been forward, you've come back, you've done reserve squadron. I'm assuming there must be a little bit of boredom as well creeping in.
Yeah, we used to make our own fun and games, you know. In my second time up the front line, we relieved the troop from another squadron. And so our bunkers were already built, the tank sites were already set in, and we were supporting the Norfolk Regiment. And they were very good. They had a very old-fashioned sergeant major. He was a funny character. He couldn't walk up the hills. He used to have two men on a rope and pull him up the hill. Proper character, but he was a great guy. And we were on, what were they called? K rations? Box rations? We were on those. And he used to say, that's not good for you guys. And he used to invite us down twice a week for a good hot meal. So they were nice people. And we supported those in the line. We had one occasion where Johnny Searle's tank, which was on top of a high hill, it wasn't 355. 355 was the worst position out of all the front line. It wasn't up there, it was on a lesser one. And I don't know exactly what happened, but his driver got in to start his tank up this particular day. And instead of going back, he went forward. And the tank slid down the front of the hill into no man's land. The Gooks, as we called them, obviously saw their opportunity and put down a heavy mortar fire. The driver got out okay, but the tank, we couldn't get it out. So obviously it was in no man's land, steep hill behind it, valley to the right and the left, and steep hills behind it. So they decided to put down a smoke screen so that engineers go down and assess the chance of A, salvaging anything out of it or whatever. So we were involved in that. And I think, I'm not quite sure, probably about 2,000 yards from me, but with a good elevation on the smoke shell, I could drop it where they wanted it. And we had about 3 tanks doing this. What they used to do, call us up and say, we want a smoke screen at such and such a time, because we knew then the engineers were going down to look at it. We did that for several days, but the Dukes got handy. As soon as they saw the smoke screen, they put a mortar barrage over it, didn't they? And in the end, they did an estimation. It cost more for smoke shells than the cost of the tank. So in the end, the engineers went down and blew it up, and that was it.
Right.
So that was the end of that one.
Were you under fire a lot? Were there sort of lots of mortar attacks?
No, as I said, I was very fortunate out there. Some of our tanks were hit quite heavily. As I told you, I've got a cut-in of Busty Irving's tank where he had all his toolboxes blown off and his mud guards blown off. We had a couple of soldiers killed by mortar fire. A Kiwi corporal was on watch, sitting in his turret, observing, and a mortar shell landed in his lap, killed him and his crew. So they had to take the tank out and obviously take the bodies out, which was not a very nice thing. Another instance, I am jumping about through the weather because it's a job to
Sure.
keep going. Another instance was, we found in the winter, with water going in the engine compartment, and as you know, the gear changes and steering was by rods in the Centurion, they would freeze solid and you couldn't operate the tank. Well, on this occasion, the HQ wireless tank, which used to drive up the top of the hill every day for communications, the driver got in it one day. We'd had a very, very sharp frost the night before. I suppose it was routine. He never checked everything was all right. He just started the tank up. It had been left in first gear for parking and the brakes were off. So he just moved off. Got almost to the top of the hill. You don't want to hear anything else, do you? Went to put his brake on. No brakes. Right? Tried to hold it with the gear and he couldn't, and the tank run back down the hill out of control, run over a tent and killed 3 men. Terrible.
From the regiments?
Sorry?
From the regiments?
Yeah, oh yeah. Well,
Right.
it went back into the HQ camp area.
Oh, that's awful.
See, what they used to do, the tank would go up there in the evening, do the net call around all the squadrons, come back down and park up, and then next morning drive back up to start daily communications again. So that was a disaster. Coming back from, I'm going a little bit out of sync.
Yeah.
Another instance was in the very cold winter. This was in January, February time. I showed you the photograph. Remember, we were sleeping in canvas, tents, or whatever we could find. And the coldest night was minus 40 degrees. It was difficult to wash. I used to leave a bowl on the old space heater inside the tent with water in, so it was warm, so I could shave and wash quick. And then they banned heaters at night time because a corporal got burnt to death. His space heater blew up or something and caught fire. And Corporal Smith, he was a wartime soldier. He was burnt to death. So we had to do away with that. And then, because of the very cold weather, the antifreeze in the tank cooling system was almost neat, very, very strong, and the guard on patrol used to start the tanks every hour and run them for 10 minutes just to warm them up and keep it going. So that was another duty you had to do. I think quite possibly just a quickie on the leave we used to have. Every soldier was allowed RTR, not RTR.
So rest and recuperation.
Rest,
yeah.
Rest and recuperation, or whatever they call it. And we used to fly from Seoul to Tokyo, stay in the barracks in Tokyo. It was an old submarine, Japanese submarine station. We'd fly into there, have a change of clothes and everything, and well looked after, good food. Transport into Tokyo. We used to go down the Ginza beer hall and have a few beers. The Americans used to let us in their PX club, and we used to go in there for a meal. So that was very good. But one instance was, I picked up this plane in Seoul to fly out to Tokyo, and it was the old Dakota with web seats along the fuselage, right? Not very comfortable. And when we landed in the airport. Oh, how the plane ever stopped or kept on the ground, I don't know. It bounced all over the place. When we got out, the pilot got out and he was so drunk he couldn't walk. So that was that. That was another experience.
Oh dear, oh dear. When you were in the forward positions in your tanks, what were the rules of engagement?
Well, the rule was if you saw movement, you could fire at it. But it wasn't always movement that you wanted to fire at, because we knew that the North were well dug in their trenches. So I used to observe every day, probably almost every day, all day, looking for different things. And if I saw a new observation hole in the side of the hill, which told me they'd moved their old P-post, I thought, well, even if there's no one in there, if we destroy it, it gives them another problem. And to do this, I used to batch all my ammunition. It's very important, because you're probably aware that if you go away from batch, the range can vary anything up to 20, 50 yards. So my main decision was I would batch as much ammunition of the same batch as possible. And once I'd laid on with that ammunition, I knew within a couple of shots I could hit the target. And this is what I used to do. And it was very successful at times, but it didn't please the colonel very much. And he got in touch with Mike Tompkin, who was air squadron leader. And Mike Tompkin came up, got on the back of my tank. He said, "Sergeant Bellinger, why are you shelling these places nearly every day and nobody else is doing it?" I said, "Well, sir, it's quite obvious. I'm looking out for problems and I'm trying to solve them." "Good," he said, "keep it up." And that was that.
Oh, excellent. Did you have any other opportunities to fire at the enemy?
Yeah, I told you we were with the Norfolks, and we got on very well with them. They were a very nice set of guys. And the captain of the Norfolks come up one day and explained to me that when they sent a recce out at night time, there was always a strong contingency of North Koreans, whether they be Chinese or North Koreans. And they used to come down between this steep valley in the hills, and they come onto a kind of plateau which probably was 50 yards wide and 100 yards long, and then it came to the barrier where Norfolk's was one side and the Gooks were the other. So I said, "What do you want me to do?" He said, "Well, I'd like you to put a barrage down when I tell you." I said, "Well, I shall have to lay on first during the daylight so I know what the range is and where it's going to be." So I told him what I'd do. I had a word with my gunner, who was Cider Sims. Loved it, good boy. Our first two shots landed right in the middle of the target, so we knew where we were on. And we set the level and the angle of the gun for us to set up at night time. And I said to him, what I'll do is I'll drop 2 shells where I've already dropped 2, and then I will just move the gun up or down slightly, left or right slightly, so it spreads the barrage across the whole area. He said, "I'll call you when we're ready, and when we're in position, and when we see them coming down, because they come down quite slowly," he said, "when I say shoot, let go." So I said, "No problem at all." So he called me up. I'm not sure what radio it was. I think it was an 18 set. I'm not sure. Anyway, he called me up on it. He said, "We're ready. I'll give you a bell. About a minute later he said, shoot. Now my loader and gunner, I could get about 4 shells or 5 shells in the air at once at that range, if the loader's quick enough, and he was a good loader. So we did that. I said to Cider, I'll leave it to you, up, down, right, left. You do it yourself once I say fire. So we did that, and we must have done a good job, because he called back and said, you've wiped them all out, well done. And that was, what, success?
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow. That's really, really good. Did you see any other action, or were you involved in any other deliberate actions from the regiment?
No, there was a case where, and this was most unusual, we had a Canadian regiment on our right. I would say, I'm not too sure, probably 1,000 yards on the same hill line that we were on, and they were infantry. And it wasn't known till after the action that during the night before, a large contingency of Chinese had crept forward, camouflaged themselves, and laid under cover all the next day, ready to attack at last light. Now, how they laid there without being observed, whether the Canadians weren't watching enough, I don't know. Can't blame anybody. But this, I don't know, I think there was something like 50 or 60 gooks laying just below the lines of the Canadians, ready to attack. Because if they attacked normally, a patrol would have seen them coming. I don't know what. Anyway, I had a call up to say, they gave me the range and the area when the attack started. So I laid on to that area the best I knew, because it was getting dark, obviously. And we let a few shells go over there. And evidently the Canadians did repel them, and we did kill a few with the shells. But that was just another simple incident that we... So we had a good understanding between the Americans. They were very good with us. Canadians, they were very good as well.
What about air support? Did you have any?
Yeah, we had good air support. We didn't used to call on the Air Force direct, but if we saw a lot of movement, or we could hear a lot of movement, because if everything was silent, okay, you could hear heavy stuff across the valley, because bear in mind we weren't terribly far away at times. So if we saw this movement or heard it, we would call HQ, and they would call up an airstrike, and they would come in an airstrike, and mostly napalm. So they would probably drop a couple of napalm bombs, and that would cover the whole top of a large hill. Pretty lethal, but I suppose that was the best way to do it.
What about the enemy? Did you see any enemy aircraft?
No.
No, not at all.
Bear in mind, as I told you, I didn't see a terrible lot of action. I did quite a bit of shooting, but other than that, it was far distant, and except for a couple of mortars coming over close a couple of times, nothing else. But, and this is very important, a lot of our troops did have and see a lot of action. And I think I was probably one of the lucky ones that was always in a safe place. As I explained before, Bosnia was very heavily shelled. We had men killed. We had the Kiwi killed in his tank. And Hill 355, which was used to protrude right into the enemy area. And there was always a tank troop up there, and they used to get shelled 24 hours a day. So I was lucky, really.
Obviously, with the ground and the terrain being as it was, I'm assuming that logistics and getting supplies forward was quite difficult. But what was that like?
Sorry?
Getting supplies forward.
Well, I think there's no doubt in my mind we were the poor relations. The Yanks were very rich, plenty of money, but no booze. The Canadians were well looked after, but they were very strict and military. They used to run one of the camps, prison camps, and they were so vicious the blokes never went back there twice, so I hear say. And so, yes, we were poor relations, and I think it was every man for himself, do what you could. And going back when I first got there, our equipment was very poor. I slept on a first aid stretcher for the first 2 months because that's the only bed I could find. It was slung between 2 beer crates, empty of course. And then I bumped into this American driver with a big Dodge lorry one day, and he stopped for me actually, and he said, "Hiya, Sarge," he said, "have you got any booze?" I said, "Well, what have you got?" He said, "What do you want?" I said, I want 4 camp beds. Got them on board, he said. I said, "What about some rations?" Got them on board, he said. I said, "I've only got 1 bottle of gin." He said, "That's good enough." So I gave him the bottle of gin. He gave me 4 brand new camp beds, and he also gave me a 1-day 20-man platoon rations, which included cigarettes, toilet paper, toothpaste, brushes, razors, and 3 meals a day. So I thought that was quite a good bargain. I took that back and I shared it out with the troop. That was one good thing. And then I was finishing up as finishing up as transport sergeant before I was due to go to crew commander. And I heard there was a chance of getting a Jeep, one way or another. So I got one of my drivers to drop me into Seoul, and I met up with these 2 American sergeants. And they said, "Have you got any booze?" I said, "Yeah, what have you got?" He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want a Jeep." "Ooh," he said, "Yeah, we can manage that, I think." "What have you got?" I said, "I've got 2 bottles of brandy." "That's very good," he said. "Give me the brandy, I'll go and get the Jeep." I said, "You go and get the Jeep, you'll get the brandy." So one of them stays with me and the other one goes off. And about half an hour later, after drinking a drop of sake and a few beers, he turns up with a brand new Jeep. No markings on it at all. So I said, "That looks good." I said, "Let me get and sit in front first and you sit by the side of me." I said, "I'll start up, I'll give you the booze, you jump out and I'll go." He said, "That's all right, good." So we did that, and I thought, ooh, if I go out the way I came in, they might be waiting for me. So I drove out of Seoul, the opposite way around, right round the border, back, got to Teal Bridge, which was a wooden constructed bridge across the Imjin. Not thinking of this, there was MPs on the entrance to the bridge and the exit the other side. So they stopped me up and they said, "Where are you going, Sergeant?" I said, "I'm going back to my unit, which is about 3 miles up the road there." He said, "Where's your paper?" I said, "I haven't got any, I just picked this up from depot." He said, "A bit late at night, isn't it?" I said, "Well, yeah, I stopped off to have a look round." He said, "Any paperwork?" I said, "No, they're going to send that on. It wasn't ready." He said, "Oh dear." He said, "Okay, off you go." I said, "Well, phone the other end and let me through, won't you?" He said, "Yeah, I'll do that." So he lifted the barrier, drove over the bridge, and as I got, barrier went up, drove back. Parked it up behind my tent that night. Got up next morning, got out of the LAD corporal, Ron Teague. I said, "Ron, hack the engine number off that Jeep and also look for the chassis number and take that off and get our badges painted on straight away." "Okay," he said, "no problem." Within a day it was all done. I went to Mike Tonkin, the squadron leader. I said, "We've got Buck Ryan, who's prepared to take my job as transport sergeant." I said, "All the vehicles are on the road, sir. Now, they're all done. And I've got a present for you." He said, "Oh, have you?" I said, "Yes, sir. Come with me." Took him down, showed him the Jeep. I said, "That's yours." "Where did it come from?" I said, "I shouldn't ask questions, sir. There's no identification on it at all. and that's it. And that's how we got the Jeep into the troop.
So obviously a very busy time, an interesting time in career. When you came to the end, towards the end of that tour, what was on the cards for the regiment?
Well, we all knew that after their tour of duty, which would end in December 52, we were well informed early in the year that the regiment was not coming back home, but they were going to the Middle East, which obviously was not on my cards. And when I was due to leave the regiment, the colonel interviewed me and asked me what my plans were within the regiment. And I said that unfortunately, if we're going back to the Middle East, this would not suit me because I'd only just been married before we came out. It wasn't fair on me and it wasn't fair on my young wife. As you told me, my prospects were good if I stayed in the regiment. If you can allow me to go on leave and discuss the situation with my wife before you go to the Middle East, then I'm quite prepared to consider signing on longer. He was quite good. He said it wouldn't be fair on other people who would want to do the same, and therefore he couldn't grant me that leave. So I said, well, thank you, Colonel. I'm afraid I'll have to leave. And that's what I did. Right. The last parade we went on, there was 4 sergeants who were leaving the B Squadron. B Squadron had a parade to say goodbye to us, and they all cheered us off. And we took a train, a lorry down to Seoul, and then a train down to Busan, where the transit camp was. And we were waiting for the trooper to come in to take us home. We stayed in the transit camp, I think it was about 10 days. And the trooper, Devonshire, came in port with another load of soldiers and materials. You're probably aware the Devonshire was a First World War trooper, a real old rusty, rough bucket, if you could call it. When we got on board, the facilities were very poor. The food was all right, but other than that, the facilities, we had long table mess decks below decks, and at night time we had to sling hammocks above the mess decks and slept in hammocks, and that was all the way home. Coming through the China Seas, there was a very, very heavy swell, so the boat was obviously going up and down like a cork. No stabilisers or anything like that, too much of a luxury. We got through there, came down up through the Suez Canal, entered the Mediterranean. First day in the Mediterranean, we had severe storms, gale force 8. We were supposed to call into Valletta in Malta to pick up a sick soldier, but we couldn't get into the port because it was too rough. So we kept sailing, came up through Gib, crossed the Bay of the Biscay, rougher than ever. Even the crew were not well on it. We managed to hold our own, I think most of us. We pulled up into the Irish Sea. I think it was the 19th of December. So we were getting near Christmas, and we're obviously all looking forward to Christmas leave. The storms were still raging, and for 3 days we sailed up and down the Irish Sea because we couldn't get into port in Liverpool, because that's where we were due to land. I was in charge of a largely mob party of time-served soldiers. I had all the paperwork, and I was supposed to go up to Catterick with that and not go home on leave. So I went and saw the RTO officer, and I said, this ain't on. I said, I've been away a year. Don't worry, he said. We'll pass it on. You go on leave. So they give me... went up the Mersey on the 22nd of December, got off the boat On the 23rd of December, we'd already collected our money and our passes, 3 weeks passes, and a ticket to home. And I got home on the evening of the 23rd of December. So that was very handy, that was very good. I thought the RTO officer was very kind. Then, after my leave was due, we had to report to Bovington camp for demob. So we got a train down to Bovey, went into camp, walked into camp. Sergeant Major come up to me, he said, "Sergeant Bellinger?" I said, "Yes, that's me, Sergeant, sir." He said, "You're on court-martial duty tomorrow."
Oh, good God.
I said, "Whoa, hold on a bit." I said, "I'm due for demob." I said, "I'm time expired." Can't help that. He said, "You're on duty." I said, "Okay, what's the dress?" He said, "Best BD, belt and gaiters." I said, "Revolver?" He said, "Yeah, draw a revolver from the..." Bloody revolver. From the stores. I said, "When do I do that?" He said, "I'll see to that first thing tomorrow morning before the court starts." I said, "Okay." Got billeted down. About an hour later, he come in, he said, "You're off duty." He said, "We've had a call from the War Office. Why isn't Bellinger demobbed?" So, that was all very well.
So obviously the army trying to get their money's worth right up to the last minute.
So that was it. And so I went before this captain. I don't know what he was. He said, "Oh, here's your whatever it is." I'd have my uniform on and pick up civilians from the store. Do that. Here's your ticket. I said, "Where's my leave pass?" He said, "You've just come back off leave." I said, "That was disembarkation leave. I now want demob leave." I said, "No, I'm due 6 weeks demob leave." "I don't think you are," he said. I said, "I'm sorry, sir, I know I am." Check with the orderly room. Well, he was orderly room, so he checked up. He said, "Yes, you're right." He said, "Okay." So he gave me a ticket for 6 weeks leave, trying to fiddle me again, wasn't he? Went down the stores, handed all my kit in. You know what demob suits were like. And trained back home, and that was it. I was finished with the army.
Job done. But of course, that wasn't the end of the story with your time with the regiment in a way, because you then became a staunch and long-serving member of the Regimental Association. Can you tell me actually when you joined and why you joined?
Yes, what I found was comradeship and friendship in the army was second to none compared to Civvy Street. There's no doubt about that. And in 1954, I got in touch with the association. They told me what the procedure was. I think they suggested an annual sub. I think it was £3, 10 shillings or something like that. So every year religiously, I used to send a postal order. I couldn't afford a checkbook in those days to pay my subs. And so I was a member of the association. And my first cavalry weekend was in May 54, and last year was my consecutive 60 years attendant. So I didn't miss one for 60 years.
That's incredible.
I joined the association committee. I'm not quite sure when it was, but I did 31 years on the committee of the association. Got very interested in different functions and whatever was going on. And in the early days, we didn't used to meet on a Sunday and just have lunch. There was always a dinner dance on a Saturday evening. The first one was at Shepherd's Bush in the TA Centre. The regimental band, always, when available, always used to come and play. We used to have a dinner and a dance, and this went on for many years. and we had many different venues. Pimsred House at Bishopsgate for 3 years. We did that. We did York Barracks in Queen's Road. Was it?
I think so. Yes.
There, and very many venues. And then later on, they found that the attendance wasn't quite so good, so they did away with the Saturday evening meetings. In 1987, 5 years before the amalgamation, Jake Clayton, who was a Sergeant Major in A Squadron, was the carrier of the association banner, or flag, whichever you want to call it. And he said to me, would I take over the duties of carrying the standard, which I was very privileged to do. So I carried the Skins flag for 5 years, almost 5 years, and then I carried the RDG flag for a further 16 years. So in all I carried it for 21 years. And then I think it was about 4 years ago I handed the flag over to Joe Monks, who carries it now. Got very much involved of interest within the association. I attended quite a few funerals with the flag for different people who requested it. And I did it with no charge. I never charged anything at all. I felt it was a privilege to do the duty, and I enjoyed doing it. I got very much involved with the memorial stone at All He Was, Arboretum, and got very much involved with that, and eventually we got that planted in there, and we had a ceremony over that, which pleased me very much. And I intend to carry on going to the reunions for as long as I can.
Right. Well, Jack, it's been an absolute pleasure an honour actually, and a privilege to interview you today. And thank you for your time. And I know that people listening to this in time to come, whether they be researchers or members of the regiment, will look back and have a much better idea of what life was like post-war, up through career and beyond. And thank you for all your work.
But before you switch off, Barry, some of the dates might be a little inaccurate, because remember, it was a long it was a long time ago.
You will be forgiven.
Okay, that's fair enough then.